They're here, but not all there.
So tonight we're going to talk about Christian kindness. All right, where did the Bible come from? What is this thing we're calling the Bible? Why do we give it our allegiance? Why do we follow it? Why do we allow it to guide our lives? And so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the history of the Bible in particular. And last week we went through a lot of different steps, some different items that we looked at so that we can know what we have, that we can be assured and confident in what we have. And because there are theologians out there, people who are Bible professors, Bible scholars, who look at the Bible and they say, this isn't it. This isn't it. And we noted one particular scholar a German scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman, who makes it very clear. He wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. And he makes it very clear that his stated purpose in all of his studies, because we don't have the original autographs, we don't have those original writings, we cannot know that what we have is the Bible. And so we set off to show that, oh yeah, we can. We can. We absolutely can. We're going to tie up a couple of things, and then tonight I want to get into the history of the English Bible, and I'm going to try to do this in one night. But there's a lot there, so we may roll over to next week with this. I'm hoping not. But I've been told, and I don't see this personally, but I've been told I can ramble. But I don't know what crazy person would say that. But seriously, in talking about the confidence we can have, and let me give a couple more illustrations to this that I want to touch on. Who remembers the number of manuscripts that we have of the Bible that we gave last week?
You said there are 400 to 500 different mistakes.
Yeah, we did talk about the variants, the different variants.
I've got a question for you on that.
Okay, go ahead. Bring it on.
You know, you said there were things like A and D, but what about Acts 2:38? Does it mean 4 or because of?
No, it's ace. It's ace. Ace is a word that it's a preposition. It usually dictates movement, something toward something else. There's about a dozen different uses of the word. It bases on context. It's never causal. It's never causal.
That is the premise of many denominational.
Yeah, and you know, most of those people, and not all, and this is going to be kind of sound a little jerky, which I've been told I can be jerky too. But most of the individuals who make that kind of argument haven't really done any Greek scholarship. It's an argument from English. And you know, I mean, that is what it is. But because in English, you know, for the remission of sins, we use for as causal. It can be causal. And so that's where that comes from. A lot of that comes from. But
That's their argument against it.
yeah, but that's not a variant. That isn't a variant there. That's a very straightforward, very agreed upon reading.
Saying their sins have already been forgiven.
Right.
And you're doing that
Right.
just as a show.
An outward show of an inward faith or inward show of an outward faith. I don't know, whatever.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. What is used instead of for in that sentence?
Nothing.
Okay, I thought there was a discrepancy.
No. That's not a variant.
Oh.
That's not a variant. That's a very, very agreed upon text. Okay, back to the manuscripts. We have 25,700 manuscripts of the New Testament. And that's total. That's including about 5,000, a little over 5,000 that we have in Greek, which was the language it was written in, plus all of the other ancient languages that it had been translated to back in the day. And so there's Latin, there's Syriac, there's Coptic, all of these different languages translated to. So all of these ancient manuscripts, we have over 25,700. Is that a lot? If someone told you, if 25,000 people came up and told you a piece of information, would you believe it after that? Agnes wouldn't, but everybody else would, right? We would. I mean, 25,000 witnesses to something is a lot. Now, I'm going to put this in perspective because, the Bible, the New Testament in particular, is what we're talking about. But the Bible itself isn't the only ancient document. What other ancient documents can you think of? The Iliad. Very good. What else?
What Josephus wrote.
Josephus. Not Bocephus, the country music star, but Josephus. What else? Okay. All right. Now, I want to put some of this stuff into perspective. We found a lot of things. Beowulf, the old Greek play, Beowulf. Oedipus. The Iliad, as was mentioned before, there's a lot of histories. Caesar wrote a history. Tacitus. Polybius. You have Thucydides. The Thu guy. Thucydides. They have histories. And when you look at the original, when they were originally written, and then the manuscripts that we have for them, there's a huge swath of time. Several hundred years, sometimes even more than that. Sometimes even 1,000 years in between. But I want us to date a couple of the more popular, more interesting, some of the older manuscripts of the New Testament, just as an example of what we have. Because the argument is, if they're copied and copied and copied and copied, we've all played the telephone game. It's going to get messed up down the line. And so if we copy over centuries of time, so since there's hundreds of years, thousands of years in between the original writings and this, we can't know. Well, okay, the oldest known fragment of a manuscript that we have is from the Gospel of John. And it dates back to about 120 AD. That's the oldest. Now, it's thought that the writing of John was in the mid-80s. And so you're looking at something that very well could have been copied directly from the original. A first-generation copy, possibly. I'm not saying that's the case, but possibly it's old enough. So just about a 40, 50-year gap there. There's another one, that's called, by the way, the John Rylands fragment. There's another fragment called the Chester Beatty. It's P45 through 47. This contains the entirety, almost the entirety, most of the New Testament, and it dates back to 250 AD. And again, that's very, very close to those original writings. That's not that far away. There's another set of collection called the Bodmer Collection, which contains part of the Old Testament and the New Testament. That dates back to 200 AD. So again, do you see what we have here? What we're pulling from? When the liberal theologians come in, and I'm not using that term liberal how we use it, that's just the term used, but because of how they view Scripture. And they view a loose interpretation of Scripture is where that term comes from. I'm not playing the politics game or anything when I use that. I realize those terms are used for almost anything. You don't like someone's cologne, that's what we do in the South. So anyway, but when these theologians come along and say, we can't know because the autographs, the originals were here and all the manuscripts are way from down here, that's not the case. That's not necessarily the case. We have manuscripts that span the entirety of these times. And as stated earlier, 25,700 ancient manuscript copies of the New Testament. But here's what really, really highlights this issue to me. Okay? Anybody know, this is by far, by the way, as far as ancient documents go, the most evidence. The one ancient document that has the most manuscript evidence of any other thing that we have is the New Testament scriptures.
Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, that's a part of it. That would be a part of that 25,000. But that was mainly Old Testament. And we're going to get into that in a minute because that's an interesting little tale too. But that's the most manuscript evidence. Who knows what number 2 is? It was said earlier.
I think it's the Iliad.
It's the Iliad. It's the Iliad. No, it's actually a little bit more than that, but it's still a startling number. 25,700 for the New Testament. The Iliad, 643. That's a big gap, right? But we question the New Testament. You know how many scholars question the Iliad? Zip. And the Iliad manuscripts, now, do you remember when the Iliad was written? 800 BC. Okay? That's old. That is old. That's before black and white. They just had white back then. That was old, right? No, 800 BC. And the earliest manuscript we have is 400 BC. 400-year gap. And you know what? They don't make a big deal out of that at all. With the New Testament, they do. Do you see a discrepancy there in the thinking? Okay, let's go on. This is neat too. Tacitus, Roman historian, he wrote a work by the name of Annals. It was written in 100 AD. This is number 3, by the way. Anybody want to take a guess at how many manuscripts?
21.
Oh, you were so close. 20. 25,000 to 680, down to 20. Can you guess how many academics question the validity of the translation of Annals by Tacitus? Zero. And not only that, can you guess, you got 21 out of 20, okay? 20, you're close. So can you guess the oldest manuscript, where it dates from? Now, this was written in 100 AD. The oldest manuscript we have of Tacitus's history, Annals, from 1000 AD. 900-year difference. And guess what? No one cares. All of a sudden, it's not a big deal. All of a sudden, it's not an issue at all. And we can look at other things. Thucydides' history, Plato, Caesar's Gallic Wars. The originals are all lost to time, and the manuscript we have are close, in all 3 of those cases, close to 1,000 years later. And no one bats an eye at that. But with the New Testament, we have 25,700 witnesses dating back to even 50 years approximately after the writing of one, beginning in about 120 AD approximately. And scholarship is almost split down the middle. Isn't that crazy? That's crazy. And you know, the great advantage of the New Testament is that no other ancient book has nearly so many, and so much manuscript evidence. And we can take all of that, and we are so close to the truest text now than we ever have been before. And to say I can't trust the Bible's accuracy, it's just a misnomer. One of two things: they're not being honest with themselves, or they don't know the evidence. But when you look at the evidence like we did last week, and looking at this and these numbers, it becomes very, very clear what we have here. And we can believe it with beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, something happened, and something has really happened since the age of enlightenment and the age, and that is a shift in the scholarship of Scripture. And now a lot of the scholarship is going to try to disprove Scripture and the authenticity of Scripture, and that's where a lot of these problems come from, because of that mindset. But if the amount, even if we destroyed all of the manuscripts, all 25,700 manuscripts, and you were able to erase all of the hard drives that held all of our digital copies, 99% of Scripture could be reconstructed from the writings of the church fathers in the first 300 years of Christianity. In fact, there was one scholar by the name of Origen. He lived from 184 to 253. His name was Origen. He's considered one of the church fathers. A lot of his writings are out there. He quotes the New Testament over 17,000 times in his writing. And just on his writing alone, we can construct the entirety of the New Testament except for 11 verses. 11 verses. That's how sure we can be that we have a text that we can trust. Now, these liberal theologians, they started attacking the New Testament, and then they began to attack the Old Testament. And they were using these arguments about the Old Testament because really the best Old Testament text and the oldest came from about 900 to 1000 AD. And you're talking about the Old Testament, which was way in the BC era, right? And so they were like, well, if we can't trust the new and we're using these arguments, look at the old. Now, last week we went into, do you remember how we went into how the scribes of the Old Testament did their thing? They would measure out the parchment and they would count all the lines, and each line had to have a certain amount of letters and the go and a certain amount, and all of these things. And that's how we can be assured that even these old, these relatively newer, I guess is not older, but manuscripts from 1000 AD are accurate. And by the way, there's a name for it. You may have known the name. It's called the Masoretic Text. You may have heard that before, and that's what we're talking about here. That was, for the longest time, the oldest Old Testament manuscript we had. And everybody thought it was very, very easy to trust because of the way the Old Testament scribes and the Jewish scribes copied things. But now here these liberal theologians are coming around and they're saying, well, wait a minute, we're making these arguments here. We can apply that to the Old Testament too. We don't have the Old Testament. And then a shepherd boy lost a sheep in the area of Qumran, Israel, in 1947. And he's out looking for sheep. And you know what kids do when they're out looking for something? And he had to find a sheep, but kids get distracted, right? And walking around, I gotta find this stupid sheep. I can just hear them kicking rocks. And for some reason, there's something about a young male in that 12, 13-year-old range and rocks on the ground that you love to throw. And well, he picks up some rocks, and he gets the idea, well, if a sheep went into one of these caves that are all around in these mountains, so he began to throw the rocks in the mountains. He didn't want to go in and check every single one, probably, right? And he threw it into a certain cave, and he heard something smash. Come to find out, what he hit was a clay jar. And within the clay jar, do you know what he found? He found a scroll. This ended up being, and probably still is, one of the greatest biblical discoveries of at least the modern age. And we know them, Don has mentioned them, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. And why they are so important is, first of all, they opened up our eyes. Once we had all of them translated, which it took until about 1970 to publish them, translating them. That's how many there were. But it opened up our eyes to culture. It held the keys to unlock some questions we had in the Old Testament text about why certain things happened. But above all, those scrolls, which comprise every book entirely of the Old Testament except for one. Anyone guess the one book it left out? Job? Nope. Nope. Any other guesses? I'm going to give you a clue, okay? Qumran didn't have ladies' classes, evidently. Esther. It had every book but Esther. Every book but Esther. And they dated back, not to the 10th century, but they dated back, some of them all the way back to 200 BC. And you know what? Those ones from 200 BC, when compared to the Masoretic text, they were identical. Talk about scribal accuracy of those Jewish scribes. They were identical. And so again, even our Old Testament, we can be assured we've got it. We've got it as close as possible to those originals, just from the scribal accuracy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, if you're into Old Testament study, which I know all of us are because we've taken polls here, and Leviticus, for some reason, is y'all's favorite book. But no one laughed at that. Come on. But if you go out to do Old Testament research, look at your source and make sure it's post-1970, because that means it's going to take into account what the Dead Sea Scrolls have affected, because they have changed a lot of the way we looked at the culture of that time. Yeah.
I know you weren't alive then, so you can't give a first-person account, but
considering discoveries like that, what you talked about in the last class in the New Testament, how accurate then would a Bible have been in just say 1900? Like what, I mean, what, obviously you're saying it was identical, so they still had most of the verses, but like, have we seen like significant changes in important scripture, or is it just in like grammatical changes that don't change the text?
I would say, I would back that up because the 1800s played in it a very significant part. In 1800, we probably had at about 90%. We were about 90% there, if not more. Very, very accurate. The changes go back to the variants that we found, and the majority of the variants are grammatical mistakes, misspellings, doubled word left out, very insignificant. And out of that, only 2 deal with text more than 3. Handful deal with 1 or 2 verses. And most of those are scribal editions. None of them change doctrine. So we've been there. We've been there a while. The best thing that it helps us in, the manuscript evidence gives us support and more things to compare to, which is always better. And what's also helped is the scholarship of the dead languages. The more we find and the more extra biblical sources we find, the more we can understand how these words were used. And the more we understand how those words were used, then we can take that back to the biblical text and say, okay, well, we might need to adjust this, might need to adjust that. And the more we learn, and we're learning more about these dead languages every single year, the more accurate we can get to the original idea of the authors. And so, you look at this evidence, and it is just absolutely remarkable. Okay, let's move on from here. Chapters and verses, that's an issue. Did you know Paul did not use chapters or verses?
He used one long run-on sentence.
He just used one. It was almost like Hemingway like that, right? Chapters and verses weren't a thing. Anybody know where chapters and verses came from? Okay.
Did the king bring him?
Nope. It was actually before that. A little interesting side. It won't take a whole lot of time to deal with this, but in about 250 A.D., the Greeks started putting in paragraph divisions in their copies, and so it all started with paragraphs, and then about 1220 A.D. ish. A man by the name of Stephen Langton. He was a professor at the University of Paris. He would go on to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. He divided up the Bible into chapters for reference sake. And so, that's how it started. It wasn't just, we're going to do this, boom, here it is. It started back with the Greeks going into paragraphs to make it more easily readable. And now Stephen Langton using chapters almost 1,000 years later in 1220. 300 years after that, verses were introduced. And we'll look at that a little bit more as we get into the English Bible. And so it was a long time before those. Just general consensus, let's chase a rabbit because there's no way I'm finishing on time tonight. Chapters and verses, good or bad? Got a good over here? Why?
I think that the amount that you maybe lose in like sentences that maybe are incorrectly split up is gained in like just how easy it is to reference. Like you can, it's so much easier to call something up and this is on page 3,467 as opposed to this is book chapter verse.
Yeah, and that's also a positive when you think of the numerous printings of even the same version, English version of the Bible. Maybe on page 500 here, page 600 here, page 700 here. It's a reference, absolutely, right? Where would we be without chapters and verses in our modern, how we handle the Bible today? Anybody see any negatives with them?
Sometimes paragraphs start off in a place you wouldn't suspect it to.
Yeah, very strange divisions. The verses aren't full sentences a lot of times. Chapters are broken in the middle of a story sometimes. Just odd placements there.
Seems like a lot of them, you know, you've always said one of your favorite words is therefore, because it thanks to bringing up something earlier, but that's always at the beginning of a verse, or at the beginning of a chapter.
Yeah, a lot of times it is.
Like, why didn't they combine that together? If it's therefore because of this,
Right.
why are you reading it now? So,
What has it done with our ability to handle context?
it kind of miscues it a little bit, because, as I said, you know, when you're saying therefore, you don't always know exactly what he's talking about for therefore.
Right.
Or if they bring up the way it's split up, sometimes you can read it through, but you don't comprehend that this verse is actually referencing 5 verses before it,
Mhm.
because it's split up in like a different chapter or a different, you know, section, the way they have them in sections now. And so,
I'll say this in regard to chapters and verses. I know sometimes from the pulpit and certain lessons I've kind of come down on them. And it does. It has created a lazy culture within the church. We use the Bible as a fortune cookie, or maybe even more of a magic 8-ball. What is my Bible at? What verse is it going to throw at me today so I can have a good day and drink my coffee? You know, what verse can I put on my t-shirt to show everybody I love Jesus? You know, it's created a lazy Christian culture. It's created some beautiful memes, but it's caused us to get a wrong idea about a lot of scriptures. And so a serious Bible student, it's wonderful for reference. For the casual, it's probably done some damage in regard to context. But, that's life, right? Good and bad. Everything's have positives and negatives.
I was about to say, that's something, we actually, the other night, found a TikTok that gave a bunch of Bible verses based off of certain relationship aspects.
Mm-hmm.
But reading through some of just those verses, you had to read 3 or 4 verses above it to understand completely what that verse meant.
Yeah.
And so, I agree with that.
Yeah. So, you look at Philippians, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, isn't about winning your ball game. It's not. It's about staying faithful through trials. And so, there's issues, positives and negatives. Okay, English Bible. Yay! History. Who knows who William Tyndale is? Tyndale. William Tyndale. That's where we're going to start.
Tymdale.
Tymdale. Yes. No one?
Word name.
Know the name. There's a wonderful BBC produced movie. It's up on YouTube. I think it's called A Man of God or A Man Who Feared God. Fantastic, accurate, historical story. Very dry. It's BBC. They're British. You have to forgive them. But it's very dry, but it's wonderful as far as the accuracy of telling the life of this man. And I wish we had the time to go through all that. He was the first individual to translate the Bible into English from the original Hebrew and Greek. He spent a lifetime fighting to do it. He did it in secret. He was the first one to have it published. It was in... skip that. It was in 1525.
Was that the Hebrew or what?
From Hebrew and Greek. He did the Old and New into English. First one. He fought with the church in regard to doing it. He was deemed a heretic. And for all of his trouble, the father of the English Bible was eventually beaten, tied to a stake, and burned to death because he translated the scripture into English. But what this man did is opened up the floodgates. Because once he did that, all of a sudden, oh, and by the way, the Tyndale Bible was the first to be printed in English on the printing press, Gutenberg's press. So that was another big thing. This was a big, big step. But it also came on the heels just a few decades after Martin Luther. And there was a lot of threatening, or the orthodoxy felt threatened, and they looked at Tyndale as threatening them. And I don't understand that mindset. I try to put myself in those bishops' place and try to understand why, unless it's just an evil power grab. That's the only thing that I can think of. But they tied him to a stake and burned him to death. But it opened up the floodgates. And as soon as this happened, not long after, that was 1525, the next English Bible came out 10 years later. It was the Coverdale Bible in 1535. It was followed by what's called Matthew's Bible in 1537. It was then followed, the Church of England, the bishops, looked at all of these Bibles coming out and said, no, we got to do something. And so they produced their own translation, and it was called the Great Bible. And that came out in 1539. Also in 1539, Taverner's Bible came out. Now, 1539, there begins to be a gap because all of a sudden you have what they consider to be the English Bible, the Great Bible. And the bishops loved it. The bishops of the Church of England absolutely adored it because it used all of this religious jargon, this religious language, and it made them feel, it pushed the power of the king and the throne. The translation pushed the power of the bishops. And so they were set, right? Okay. Now, I want to make sure I get this right. Henry VII's daughter, Mary I, gains power. Henry VIII, yes, Henry VIII, thank you. Mary I gained power. Anybody remember her nickname? No. Bloody Mary. And it wasn't because she drank them. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And she despised Protestantism. Because Henry VIII, if you remember, petitioned the Pope to divorce Anne Boleyn. He refused, so he started up the Church of England and had Anne Boleyn put to death. Mary, her daughter, blamed Protestantism on her mother's death. Or her mother's death on Protestantism. She hated them. And so she was called Bloody Mary because she put a lot of them to death. To the point where a certain group of Protestants, these were known as the Puritans. We all know who the Puritans are later on. Well, the Puritans really felt like their lives were in danger. And they were very, very vocal against the Church of England and against Catholicism. They did not like that kind of bishop-oriented, orthodox type of religion. And so they escaped from England. Anybody know where they went? Nope. A little early for that. They wanted some chocolate, so they went to Geneva, Switzerland. And about the time that Mary had died, by that time, they produced what would become the most popular English Bible of their day, called the Geneva Bible. But England outlawed it because it went against the Great Bible. Because this Bible, not only did it was the first one in English to have the chapters and verses put into place, but it also had biblical notes in it. And in these biblical notes, you know what the Puritans did? They talked against the divine right of the king. And so in Exodus, when the handmaidens lie to Pharaoh and usurp his authority because God's authority, they claimed, rightly, by the way, as the apostles did, that we should obey God rather than man. And so these notes attack the divine rights of kings. England outlawed it. They would smuggle it in. If it was found on the ships, they were burned. But even though they outlawed it, it became the most popular Bible, English Bible, for quite a while. Now, Mary dies. Elizabeth I takes the throne because Mary didn't have any children. Elizabeth didn't have any children. But Mary, Queen of Scots, in Scotland, had a child the year before she died. His name was James VI. At the age of 1 year old, he assumed the throne of Scotland. Kind of tells you something about Scotland. He reigned to 1625. Of course, as a child, he didn't make decisions. But when Elizabeth was dying in 1603, well, guess who was next in line for the throne of England? It fell to James VI. And so he traveled to England in 1603 to assume the throne, and he became known as James I. You see where we're going here? When he gets there, Elizabeth took a neutral stance to religion. She would assuage the Puritans. She would assuage the bishops. She really didn't care. She wanted all the blood and all of the disorder that Mary had done to go away. And the bishops were a little irritated because they felt their power waning. Partly they blamed the Geneva Bible. And so they were irritated with Elizabeth. When she died, James comes. They meet him basically off the boat. And they say, we need to settle this religious problem. Now, James's background, he was a Bible scholar. He was raised by family of Presbyterians, but as king, he was head of the Church of England. And so he really had a little bit of feelings for the Puritan positions, but he also understood something about the divine right of kings. In fact, he had published two really quintessential works as he was king of Scotland back in the 1590s. One was called The Divine Right of Kings, where he claimed God put me on the throne, and therefore you usurp my authority, you are usurping God's authority, and so you don't mess with that. And then he wrote one called Demonology, because there was a big witch hunt in the 1590s in Scotland, because a coven of witches tried to kill his wife when he went to pick her up from Denmark in about 1592. So anyway, interesting fellow, King James. So he takes up the throne, and immediately he's forced. They said, look, you need to sign this, and all these bishops wrote this thing out, and all of these things that they wanted and demands, and the Puritans did the same thing. And so he said, you know what? We're going to have a big open court where we're going to put all of this out, and we're going to take care of it all. It's called the Hampton Court. The Hampton Court. And he stacked the Hampton Court with mainly bishops, with just very few Puritan men there as representatives. And everybody thought, the bishops were like, okay, here we go. Here we go. He's going to spank them. Watch this. He got in and on the first day spoke for 5 hours, tongue-lashing the bishops of the Church of England. And now all of a sudden the Puritans were like, oh, here we go, here we go. The list of demands the Puritans gave him, he nixed all of them. Nothing was happening. But one Puritan man went to James with an idea. Let's do a definitive version, English version of Scripture. The bishops got a hold of this, and one of the head bishops went to King James and says, let me write up the rules of translation. And so he gives 11 rules of translation to King James. Most of them were organization and places of translation where it was going to happen. But a couple of them are very noteworthy. One of them is that this translation will have no notes. All notes banned. Because the Geneva Bible, one of the biggest problems was the notes. Get them out of there. And again, this is going to be the Bible to replace every English Bible. And so that was the third rule is very, very interesting. Because the third rule says this new version will use ecumenical church language. Okay? It's going to use the language of the bishops unless the text absolutely deems it necessary that it be changed something else. And it was going to follow the revision of the Great Bible known as the Bishop's Bible. All right? And the Bishop's Bible came out in 1568 as an answer to the Geneva Bible. And that kind of took over the Great Bible. And so you had the bishops fighting with the Geneva and all this other kind of stuff. And this was going to settle it. And they gave a specific example of the term not to change. And the example was ecclesia, church. Use church for ecclesia. What does ecclesia mean? That's literal breaking the word down, but that's not how it was used. In the Septuagint, the Old Testament, Ecclesia is always translated as either assembly or, now I'm blanking on the other word. That thesaurus is always short circuits. It's assembly or gathering. That was the meaning of the word. That's the usage of the word. You break it down, it's the called out. That's what we hear preachers say. Ek, out of, kaleo, to call, called out. So it's the called out. Well, the usage of the word is assembly. They're being called into an assembly of people. And it can be used secularly. For instance, in Acts 17, it's used in a reference to the city council, and it's called an assembly there. Or it can be used in a religious sense, where it should still be assembly. In the Old Testament, it's assembly all the way through. Whether it's talking about Israel or another, it's just the assembly. But that's what the word means, assembly. But they said, no, use church. Why? What does church mean? Yeah.
Specific kind.
Let me tell you the etymology of the word church. It comes from the Greek, but it's not ecclesia. It's kuriakon doma. Doma means house. Kuriakon means Lord, the Lord's house. It's a building. Kuriakon doma was eventually shortened to kuriakon, to kurk in Danish. Went to ancient, or I guess Middle Germanic language as kirk. And then into Old English is church. We say church isn't the building. Yeah, it is. It's just a dumb translation. But here's why they wanted it. The head of the Church of England and the bishops of England knew they did not have the power to own and control the people. Oh, but they own those buildings. So you use ecclesia, that's always going to be church. And that's the one example specific given in using this theological jargon. James hated baptism, so baptism stayed and everything. That's hogwash made up by some Alabama preacher who didn't know what he was talking about. James didn't care about any of that. There's no record of that. Bishop's Bible did it like that. The Great Bible did it like that. That was just part of the religious jargon that stayed. So anyway, so James said, that's a great idea. Let's do it. Sent him out to get it done. 1611, guess what was published? The Authorized Version, we know it as what? The King James Version. Who has a 1611 King James Version? No one? And you're right, no one does. Have you ever seen a 1611 King James Version? Or a copy of a 1611 King James Version? You would barely recognize it as English. It's Middle English. It's ancient. The F's are S's, the S's are S. Cats and dogs living together is mass chaos. So, one of the biggest things about the King James Version is the preface. The preface is amazing because they understood that as more scholarship on these ancient languages became known, the more evidence and manuscripts that they found, that this thing would need revision. And they knew that they weren't perfect either, and they said, this needs to be periodically revised. Now, you talk about a revision to the King James today, you have people's heads blow up like scanners, man. But that was the intent. That was what they intended. And for 100 years, about every 10 years, a new version came out, even some that are notorious. There's one called the Murderer's Bible, because the printer made a mistake in Exodus and the Ten Commandments and said, thou shalt murder. Thou shalt commit murder. So it's known as the Murderer's Bible. There's an Adulterer's Bible. A similar thing happened, but in a different commandment. You shall commit adultery. I think that's the one Rome ended up with somehow. But over about 10 years till the last one came out, about the 9th version is what we have. Came out in the 1780s. Very Shakespearean sounding, 1780s. That's what we're reading today. So as soon as it was published, was it the #1 selling Bible in the English world? Yay or nay? People hated it. People hated it. They love their, guess what version? Geneva Bible. You're not taking my Geneva Bible. Paul carried the Geneva Bible. Jesus carried the Geneva Bible. You're not giving me that newfangled King James. Does that sound similar? Familiar to us? Now, it took 50 years for the King James to gain prominence. When the Pilgrims came over to America, they had their good old Geneva Bible in their hand. It took almost 50 years for the King James to gain prominence. And it stayed that way for centuries. Now, making fun of the history, not the version. When we're talking about the King James gets knocked around because guess what? Extremism begets what? Extremism. And you have yahoos on one side saying it's an inspired translation. Those translators were inspired. And so you know what that makes people like me do? I want to go to the other extreme and say you're a hack. And not want to use it at all. But the truth is, the King James Version shouldn't be put down because it is not just a milestone, it is an amazing accomplishment that these men did. And it stood the test of time for 400 years. 400 years. I mean, if anything, it should be treated with respect. Even though you do have that King James only segment out there that you just want to punch in the face. But you do need to treat the version with respect because it deserves it. And hey, out of all the English versions that are out there, and we'll get to the English versions post beginning about 1800 next week as we finish this up because I'm out of time. But you got to admit, when you sit down and read the King James, it's beautiful, isn't it? It's very poetic, isn't it? And they were able to do an accurate translation given the guidelines they had and still have this beautiful readability to it. Are there better translations out there? Absolutely, 100%. And we'll talk about those next week. I mean, far beyond. The King James, the biggest problem with the King James, it's not the these and thous. Those are arguments from English. The biggest problem is what's called the received text, the Textus Receptus. And for the time in 1611, that was as good as it got. But it was based on 3 codices and 25 manuscripts that they had available versus 25,700 that we have available today. That is the weakness of the King James Version. It's not the these and thous. You can learn, a monkey can learn the these and thous. You can teach your German shepherd to learn the these and thous. Just takes a little bit of effort. The ETH, that's actually nice because it shows me, hey, that's present tense. That's continuing action. The problem isn't the flowery language or the poetic Shakespearean sound or even the these and thous and all that. The problem is with the Greek text. It only accounts for 25 witnesses out of 25,700. And that's an issue. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we can see that's an issue. That's an issue. But even based on the 25 and the 2 or 3 codices, it still got more right than it did get wrong. It stands as an amazing achievement in biblical scholarship. And when I'm tempted to say, oh, the King James, I have to catch myself and say, no. It did its job, and it did its job perfectly well for almost 4 centuries. And we need to respect that. Okay, we'll end there.